All right, let's jump right into this fascinating explainer. Today, we're looking at a wildly provocative historical analysis by Grigory Tomsky that compares two seemingly opposite rulers. On one hand, we have King Louis IX of France, a universally celebrated Catholic saint. On the other, we've got Attila the Hun, a man literally known throughout Western history as the Scourge of God. I know, it sounds like an impossible comparison, right? But as we dig into the primary sources, a completely different narrative starts to emerge. Here is the wild part we are exploring today. Modern Tengrism, which is the ancient religion of the steppe peoples, is actually considering Attila for sainthood. And the absolute twist here is that the justification for this relies on the exact same virtues used to canonize King Louis IX. To impartially unpack this, we are going to systematically compare both leaders step by step, using the official criteria from the 1297 papal bull. Our agenda covers 1. Définir la santé. 2. Puissance et éducation. 3. Justice et modestie. 4. Miracles et élection céleste. 5. Tolérance religieuse et guerre. And 6. Le bilan comparatif. Let's start with Section 1, Définir la sainteté. How does the Church actually define a saint? Well, according to the foundational definition of the Church, saints are presented as practically inaccessible models of life and activity, individuals considered to be chosen directly by God. For Louis, Pope Boniface VIII formally defined him as an earthly model of virtue and a celestial elect. In fact, the papal bull of 1297 laid out a very specific measuring stick for Louis. The Pope cited his illustrious birth, his immense power, his excellent virtues, and his correct morals. So the really interesting question our source poses is this: if we take that exact same Catholic measuring stick and apply it to Attila the Hun, how does he measure up? That brings us to Section 2, Puissance et Éducation. Let's see how their backgrounds and their sheer earthly power actually compare. You know, both of these guys had incredibly privileged elite educations. Louis was meticulously educated by his mother, Blanche of Castile. Starting at age 12, he was explicitly groomed to govern. But the historical sources reveal something totally surprising about Attila. Between the ages of 13 and 17, he was educated in Italy as an honorary Roman hostage. That means he spent 4 absolutely crucial teenage years learning the inner workings, politics, and military strategies of the Roman Empire firsthand. Now, when it comes to the power requirement for sainthood, it's all about scale. And honestly, Attila kind of dwarfs his French counterpart here. The historical scholar Edward Gibbon notes that Attila united Scythia and Germania, commanding an army of upwards of 500,000 men. To put that in perspective, St. Louis's crusading forces, which relied heavily on a small percentage of elite knights, peaked at roughly 30,000 men. So in terms of raw earthly power and noble lineage, Attila easily exceeds the papal criteria. Let's move to Section 3, Justice and Modesty. Because as we know, power alone doesn't make a saint. You absolutely need humility and fairness. It's actually wild how similar their styles of governance were. We famously know the stories of St. Louis holding court directly with his people under an oak tree at Vincennes, totally bypassing all that royal bureaucracy to just give fair judgments. But historical accounts show Attila doing the exact same thing. He frequently held an open tribunal for his subjects right at the gates of his palace. He was personally listening to grievances and making sure justice was equitable, completely avoiding bureaucratic delays. In their personal modesty? Practically identical. The papal bull praised Louis for eventually rejecting royal finery and choosing simple, unadorned clothing. Well, the Roman historian Priscus, who actually sat down and dined with Attila, documented that while Attila's peers draped themselves in gold and jewels, the Hunnic king strictly preferred spotless, plain white clothes. At these massive, grand banquets where everyone else used silver and gold plates, Attila famously ate plain meat from a wooden plate and drank from a simple wooden cup. Modesty and justice are great, sure, but to be a saint you need that supernatural spark. You have to be considered chosen by heaven. Which leads us perfectly into Section 4, Miracles et élection céleste. Let's look at the miraculous events that solidified their status as chosen ones. Attila's followers, and honestly, even some of his enemies, were absolutely in awe of him. He experienced these grand visions of a unified Romano-Hunnish empire. His sheer success and strategic genius were considered by many at the time to be nothing less than a magical or divine mandate, a destiny crafted directly by the heavens. Now, the actual miracles looked a bit different depending on the culture. In the Catholic tradition, Louis is credited with physical healing, curing the paralyzed, the blind, and those with scrofula. For Attila, his divine election manifested through a legendary event. A shepherd reportedly followed the blood of a wounded heifer and unearthed the ancient golden sword of Mars. Presenting this incredible divine relic to Attila was seen across the known world as absolute proof that he was the elect of the heavens, destined to rule. All right, Section 5, Tolerance, Religious, and Guerre. This is where our modern assumptions get totally flipped on their head. We tend to picture St. Louis as this perfectly peaceful king, right? But if we take a strict, impartial look at his reign, it's actually a timeline of almost constant warfare. From his early operations against rebels to the brutal Cathar Wars, and eventually his leadership in 2 massive crusades, his rule was heavily defined by the sword and the violent suppression of what the church deemed heresy. I mean, Louis literally ordered the burning of Cathar believers at Matzagur. He mandated severe physical punishments for blasphemers. The papal bull actually goes out of its way to praise him for driving heretics from his kingdom. Which really begs the question, how did the so-called barbarian Attila treat other faiths? The contrast here is absolutely massive. Attila was guided by the Tengrist philosophy. The core belief of Tengrism was that just as God gave a hand multiple fingers, God gave men multiple paths to heaven, and this resulted in remarkable religious tolerance. During his conquests, Attila didn't enforce religious uniformity. His ultimate goal, pulled straight from Tengrism, was actually universal peace achieved through a unified world government. Let's wrap this up with Section 6, Le Bilan Comparative. Let's see how this astonishing comparison builds to its final point. If we look purely at the historical texts and the precise criteria laid out by Pope Boniface VIII, Attila possessed the exact same virtues as the celebrated King of France. In fact, in areas like religious tolerance, the Tengrist leader exhibited a much broader acceptance of diverse faiths than his Catholic counterpart. Even right in the middle of a war, Attila showed a level of restraint that is frankly incredible. He famously halted his massive invasion of Italy in 452 after simply parleying with Pope Leo. Turning back an unstoppable army purely out of diplomatic respect across religious lines? That's a phenomenal gesture. So what is the big takeaway from all of this? When we strip away the terrifying myths written by his enemies, Attila the Hun actually reflects the absolute highest virtues of his age. He matches a canonized saint step for step in power, justice, modesty, and divine mandate. And it leaves us with a truly profound question. If the ultimate scourge of God actually meets the criteria for sainthood, how many other historical villains deserve a second look? Think about that for a second.